Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. Joining us now is a good friend of the programs, good friend of We Act Radio. Dr. Maya Rockeymoore is president of the Center for Global Policy Solutions, and she specializes in a lot of the policy areas we care about here on the program. We're always delighted to have her. Maya, thanks so much for joining us.
RJ, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you for that. And listen, I really wanted to have you on the show because I saw that you are organizing another Color of Wealth Summit. And I found last year's, which I attended, to be so valuable that I thought it would be good for folks to know a little bit more about it. So first of all, let's start with, what is the Color of Wealth Summit?
So the Color of Wealth Summit is an annual event on Capitol Hill that we put on in conjunction with our Closing the Racial Wealth Gap initiative. This is a forward-funded effort that seeks to shine a spotlight on the racial and ethnic wealth gap in America. Now, most folks know about the term income inequality or wealth inequality, and they think about it broadly. They think about it as a situation involving the 1% versus everybody else. And while that gap is huge and growing, the racial and ethnic wealth gap in America is tremendous. It's something that people haven't focused on. And yet it's incredibly important that we do so because of the nation's changing demographics. So our effort to shine a spotlight on this is the 2015 Color of Wealth Summit, where we will be bringing together the nation's leading policymakers and experts who will be discussing this phenomena and its implications for our nation.
So, Maya Rockeymoore, what you're really, I think part of what you're saying is, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's kind of an interactivity between this issue of wealth inequality as it's discussed in general terms and the inequality between minority populations and the population as a whole, because not only does wealth inequality disproportionately affect those populations, but the growing size of those populations means that there's a dynamic between them. We can't address one without the other. Is that a fair statement?
That's exactly right. Just think about it. By the year 2043, the nation's the country will be majority, quote unquote, racial and ethnic minority. Now, these are the very populations that have been on the margins of the U.S. economy since the country's founding. And so, if you've got a significant proportion of the population who's growing in size, yet their households have low to negative wealth, then we're talking about a phenomena that can fundamentally change the outlook for our nation's economy and our ability to compete in the global arena.
Mm-hmm. Plus, it's just the right thing to do, right? I mean, we can't live in a country where the color of your skin or your ethnicity defines your ability to thrive or even survive economically. That's just not who we claim to be.
Well, it's actually who we claim to be. If you look at the Constitution and, 3/5 of a man, I don't know, is it 3/5 or 3/4? Excuse me.
3/5, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that we've had the history that we've had is exactly who we've claimed to be. And so now what we're fundamentally asking is, when we're talking about the American dream, we need to be thinking about it in Technicolor. We need to be thinking about it as one that involves everyone, that it's not just one population, that we really are embracing all of the talent that we have and providing equal opportunities and equitable opportunities for all populations in society to achieve their fullest potential and to be a full part of the nation's economy. And that's what we're all about. And we think that this is important in the areas of entrepreneurship. It's important in the areas of retirement security, savings and investment, you name it, home ownership. All of these areas of asset building are incredibly important for the economic security of households. And we fundamentally believe that we should be focused not just on private assets, but also on public assets like Social Security and Medicare, too, because these programs are essential for the economic stability of of households, not just working class, but also middle class.
Absolutely. And by the way, just as an aside, when I was saying who we claim to be, I was thinking less about the Constitution, which has ambivalence in it, let's say, and more about people who claim we live in a post-racial society. Whenever I hear that phrase, the first thought that comes to mind is you obviously haven't seen the statistics. Right?
RJ, when the term post-racial society came out, it was the fact that people felt proud that we voted for the very first time ever for an African-American president, and justifiably so, right? No one ever thought in their lifetime that we would see an African-American take office, and yet we have. And so people prematurely trumpeted that as evidence that we have put the issue of race behind us as a nation. But I think that, as you well know, not just the statistics, but what's happening on the streets. I mean, and Ferguson was a prime example, but it's Cleveland, it's every street in America where you're having these challenges being highlighted, that we have not put race behind us. It's very much with us. And we're seeing it in the immigration debate. I think that, it's an unspoken part of the entitlement, quote-unquote, reform debate. I think that, it kind of permeates our politics on a larger scale. And even the political parties, negotiate around and do their politics around race and ethnicity in very strange and interesting ways. And so, we are not post-racial. We are very much in the midst of our racialization. And there are things that we actually need to do to actually mitigate the ongoing influence of our racialized culture, and not only mitigate but also prepare for our nation's transition to majority, quote-unquote, minority status.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of the Color of Wealth Summit, because you've got a lot of great people there, people that I admire a lot. But before we get to that, it occurred to me, I think we warned you ahead of time, we'll just go where we go in this conversation, and in talking about the fact that we are very much in the racial period of our history and that we need to address that. Just curious to get your thoughts on this whole Starbucks controversy of last week, where for about 2 or 3 days, Howard Schultz, I guess is his name, the CEO of Starbucks, wanted to, quote-unquote, start a conversation about race by having his baristas write "Race Matters" on the cup, and that means you have to talk about race with them, or you're asked to talk about. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, immediately when I saw it, I was like, okay, oh boy. It's the concept and the idea behind it is good, but the structure of it needed work. To just have baristas with no training in diversity, no training in terms of how to actually, speak with people about these very, very touchy and sensitive issues, writing race together on a cup, and then, somehow thinking that was going to spark a conversation was slightly ill-conceived. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having, and I hate to say the term national conversation. What I want to say is a national initiative, and I would like to call it a preparedness initiative around our nation's changing demographics. And we should. And so, I would hope that a Starbucks president and USA Today and others would be willing to join in something that's beyond just a quick conversation at a coffee shop, but that focuses on what every sector of society can and should do to prepare for our nation's changing demographics. And that is my goal. I have a term that I call the inclusion revolution, and we need to be working towards making sure that we have an inclusive, diverse, and fair economy and society, and this is what the inclusion revolution is all about.
We're talking with Dr. Maya Rockeymoore about the Color of Wealth Summit, and that gets to the whole nature of the conversation, not just, and I hate that term too, by the way, but really a conversation about whether this is a society of what kind of economy we want to create, among other things. That's one dimension of the conversation. Do we want an economy that's based on growth, increasing income, opportunity, wealth for all segments of the population so that they buy things, build things, get jobs, have jobs, but make purchases that give other people jobs? Or do we want to be the kind of economy we're becoming now, which is a financialized economy, a Wall Street economy, an economy where 40-50% of corporate profits go to just the handling of money and not to the building of goods, and on and on and on. And I think, you guys, you've got, John Powell there, you've got Dean Baker, you've got Mark Zandi, you've got a lot of people at your conference who I think in one way or another, the theme right now is the United States of Opportunity. I'm reading, Advancing a New Social Contract for a Fair and Inclusive Economy. That's the gist of it, or that's a dimension of it, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. And we want the former rather than the latter. It, as you well know, it makes no sense to have an economy that's so skewed and so unequal that only a very small percentage of the population can afford to live, and everybody else is on the sidelines struggling to make it. And not only that, but we're talking about hyper neoliberal capitalism. We're talking about basically public sector assets being undermined so that they can also be siphoned for private sector interests, which would leave that society, a society where ordinary Americans, 99% mainstream Americans, are unable to fully contribute to the economy, unable to purchase goods and services, unable to fully be participants in the economy, and then unable to get any kind of assistance or support from government, is one that I don't think any of us would want to live in, and is one where that wealthy 1% will be buying bigger and bigger fences because the nature of it would be so unequal that I'm sure that it would spark some kind of dramatic backlash. And so, in order to get away from that notion, we need to be talking about inclusion. And that means in all respects, and that also means economic inclusion.
So let's talk about another dimension of this before we go, if we could. We were talking with Dr. Maya Rockeymoore about the Color of Wealth Summit that's coming up. You were there. You spoke when Representative Larson introduced a bill to expand Social Security, and it seems to me that not only do minority communities depend on Social Security, but I should say reintroduce, by the way, but not only do we live in a world where minority communities depend on Social Security, but so does that 99% we're talking about. And I lived through that whole period. I was actually consulting in the benefits area in the 80s when they were really eroding fixed pension contribution plans and the fundamental building blocks of a secure retirement for the American people. So isn't that also programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are under constant assault politically, isn't that also a key element of the agenda you're describing? Absolutely.
As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about private assets like home ownership and business ownership. It's also about public assets like Social Security and Medicare, unemployment insurance. I mean, these are assets that are critical to the financial stability of households that need the benefits that they can access through these programs. Whether that be Social Security's income supports in the face of retirement or disability or the loss of a breadwinner, or whether it be upon retirement at the age of 65 needing to access medical care. And so with that, it's vitally important that we not only protect and strengthen these public assets, especially in light of our larger retirement crisis, but it's also very important that we expand these programs to make sure that they are adequate for the populations that need them. And when you say, yes, the 99% are relying on these programs, that's absolutely right. Racial and ethnic minorities have a disproportionate reliance on these programs, a higher need for the benefits. And so when we're talking about the mix that I mentioned earlier, the nation's changing demographics, the retirement crisis, the fact that, the private sector has taken away any stability in retirement security. The public sector is increasingly trying to move away from having fixed income retirement pensions. that Social Security and Medicare literally are going to continue to be important, and that means that we have to stand guard and make sure that these programs are not eroded.
So last question for you, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore. And we've got about a minute, so it's really, in a way, it's not fair because it's a huge question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is how do we push this as a political agenda? Are we getting any traction in Washington? Is that likely to happen, or do we just keep on pushing and hope that that will follow as a result of increased public interest and demand?
And when you say this, are you talking about the racial wealth gap, or are you talking about the public assets, the importance of
the racial wealth gap overall? Yeah,
so that's why we're holding the summit.
Okay.
And we want this to be on the public agenda. And this is not a time to put our heads in the sand. We actually need to be looking at this not just as an issue affecting communities of color, but as an issue facing the nation. And we view it as a challenge for our national economic security, and as such, it needs to be a priority.
And if people go to globalpolicysolutions.org, they're going to find out about this conference, right? The summit, which is when, the 29th and 30th of April.
April 29th through May 1st. Thank you so much. Yes, globalpolicysolutions.org.
All right. Well, I encourage people to find out more about it. And Dr. Maya Rockeymoore, president of the Center for Global Policy Solutions, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, RJ. Take care.
You too. We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.